Good day, everyone. Welcome to the chapter 6 of Methods of Research. I will be discussing to you about the experimental research, the basic concepts, definition, and as a concept of one-to-one causation. Before I start, I would like to introduce myself. I am Edwin Ranyola Jr. from Ragay Camarines Sur. I hope that after this presentation, you will learn from this chapter. Okay, let's begin. Let us define first the experimental research from based from different authors and experts. According to Goodman, it is a method or procedure that involves manipulation of condition for the purpose of studying the relative effects of various treatments applied to member of sample. Always keep in mind the term method, manipulation, and treatments. In experimental research, we're always trying to understand a phenomenon. So in order for that to realize that, in order for it to be realized, we need a method and we need something that we can manipulate on the study and various treatments that we can apply on the samples so that we will be understanding what we want to discover in any study that we prefer. Next, according to Manuel and Medel, the basic purpose of research is to discover and answers the questions what will be. Also, experimental research consists of manipulating an experimental variable under highly controlled condition. Okay, in this type of research, there will always be this manipulated or manipulating and controlled or controlling. You may wonder what kind of concept or object will be manipulated or controlled. In any research, there will always be this factor, or there will always be this underlining idea which a researcher will always consider, and this is what we call the variable. There are two kinds of variable. We have the independent variable and we have the dependent variable. These two are connected or interrelated because without the one, the other cannot exist. And this has a vital role in research because in order for us to have the foundation or the standpoint, we need first to identify the variables being involved in a study. Okay, let's define first what is a variable. Variable is anything that may change or may be changed from one condition to the other. In variable, there is a change. Say for example, you wanted to eat ice cream on day 1, and on day 2, you wanted to eat vanilla ice cream. Let me say it again. On day 1, you wanted to eat chocolate ice cream, and on day 2, you wanted to eat vanilla ice cream. In that situation, there is a change of taste or preference in the flavor of ice cream. Because as was said, in the first day, you wanted to eat chocolate, and on the second, you wanted to eat vanilla. So, any alterations or change from one thing to the other is considered as a variable. Say for example, we have the height, the weight, method of teaching, language, attitude, and etc. Changing from one thing to the other is what we call variable. Okay, very good. Shape the two kinds of variable, which is the independent variable. What is independent variable? And a condition or process that is controlled or manipulated, which is applied on the sample or another thing. Okay, independent variable is the one that is being manipulated, that the researcher or the one who is conducting the study, who is authorized to control it. But why are you going to control it? And Now, it not in some instance. In all instances, independent variables is controlled and applied on the sample, which is the coexisting concept of variable of independent variable, which is the dependent variable. Dependent variable is the process or condition that which is exposed to the treatments and actions from independent variable applied. Okay, dependent variable is the one that's being exposed to the treatment given by the independent variable. Say, for example, the smell of your hair will vary on the shampoo that you are using. In that situation, the one that is being controlled, which is which? The shampoo or the smell of hair? Of course, it's the shampoo, because you are the one choosing which shampoo to be used. And which is the one that is being exposed? Which is the one that is being exposed? The hair. And when the hair is exposed to the shampoo, it will have a smell. It will have a different odor or fragrance depending on the shampoo that you use. Okay, let's have some more examples for you to further understand this. Okay, in example A, let us read. An experiment is conducted which aims to see the effect of a fertilizer, carbonized rice, in terms of growth of vegetable crop. In knowing the variables, we should always first determine the one that is being controlled. In that situation, which do you think is being manipulated? The fertilizer or the growth of vegetable crop? Or ask yourself, which do you think in that situation or study is being changed or being exposed to for you to know the dependent variable? Okay, let's identify first the independent. The independent in the study is the applied fertilizer, because you will be the one controlling on how many of fertilizer will you apply on the vegetable crop, which is the dependent variable, the growth of vegetable crop. The growth of vegetable crop will depend on the amount of applied fertilizer. Did you get it? Just always keep in mind that anything that is controlled in the study is the independent variable. In this example, the one that is being manipulated is the carbonized rice. It will be applied to on the vegetable crop, and the vegetable crop or the growth of the vegetable crop is the dependent variable because it will vary depending on the applied fertilizer. Let's have another example. Effect of genre of movies to a child's behavior. So in this situation, it is trying to understand the behavior depending on the genre of movies that the child will be exposed. Okay, child A was exposed to a fantasy movie genre, and child B was exposed to a horror movie genre. Which is the one that is being manipulated? Genre of movies or behavior? Genre of movies, of course. If you were the one who is conducting the study, which can you be controlled? Is it the behavior already? When you conduct the study, you will be able to manipulate the behavior of the child, or the movies? Of course, it is the movie. You will be the one choosing or selecting which movie, which will you expose the child, right? In order to identify its behavior. And of course, the dependent variable is the child's behavior. The child's behavior will be depending on the genre of the movies. Did you get it? Of course you did. because and let's proceed to my last topic, which is the concepts of causation. The other subtopics of this chapter will be discussed by my group mates, and we will be sending our PowerPoint presentation. If your internet is not that reliable in your area, you can down you can just read the PowerPoint, or if it is the other way around, you can just download this video. We will be sending a Google Drive link or a YouTube link in this. Wait, why am I saying this? No. If you're watching already this video, it means that you already downloaded it, and it means that your internet is reliable. Char. Okay, let's proceed. I'm just making any no wale jokes. Okay, let's proceed to one-to-one relationship. In one-to-one relationship, there is only one independent variable and one dependent variable. Just like the previous examples, that is under a one-to-one relationship. There is a one independent variable and one dependent variable. Let's see the example here. Amount of sugar in the coffee is the independent variable, and the dependent variable is the taste of the coffee. Depending on the amount of sugar placed in the coffee, the taste will vary. If it is too plenty, then it will be sweet. If it's too few, then it will be bitter. Just like that. So guys, this is just I guess hmm, I have translated my goal for today, which is to discuss to you the background of experimental research and concepts of causation. Some of you may be confused because maybe I am talking too fast. Maybe you can just download this video and replay it if you can't understand some concepts. And thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned a lot. Good day and keep safe, everyone. God bless.
The second concept of causation is the two-variable relationship. This involves two variables causing an effect upon one variable. For example, the hand water pump. The rising of the water, the effect, depends upon two factors: the amount of air pressure and the tightness of the rubber ring around the piston's bases as causes. The third concept of causation is the complex relationship. This is a case where two or more variables cause a single effect. For example, achievement in school is affected by several factors such as intelligence, adequacy of facilities, effectiveness of teaching, environmental conditions, and so many others. Well, in addition to those relationships given by Estolas and Boquiren, there are also cases where one variable causes two or more effects. We'll take the case of the sunlight. Sunlight helps plants manufacture food through photosynthesis, but it also causes evaporation, which kills plants unless it is sufficiently watered. The next one is a man drinking liquor. Well, liquor satisfies a certain desire, but it also makes him drunk, weakening his mental faculties and capacity for inhibition, making him prone to committing violent acts. Next, drinking water does several things to the body, among which are supplying liquid to body cells, helping in digesting food, helping in the excretion of waste from the body, and satisfying thirst, and so many others. Well, those are the third causes of causation or concepts of causation. The next topic is the general distinguishing features of experiments. The general distinguishing features of experiments are as follows. First one is experimentation lends itself to easier manipulation because of quantitative entities. The second is observations are done under controlled conditions. Third, gathering of valid facts is rigorous. Fourth, Experimentation can be conducted in the laboratory, in the classroom, or in the field. Fifth, laboratory experiments are intensive and exacting. Sixth, most often, experiments are limited to a small number of cases. And the last one is there is more thorough analysis of variable factors. That ends my report. Thank you.
Hello, good day. I'm Romel, and today I'm going to tackle about experimental design. So when we say experimental design, this means how participants or subject allocated to the different groups in an experiment. So we have most commonly used experimental designs in the educational, psychological, biological, or even in the agro-industrial field. So letter A, we have a single factor experimental design. So we have 5 single factor experimental design. So the first one is a single group with only a post-test design. So this involves a things, person, or a group subjected or exposed to a certain experimental factor for a certain period of time. So that means you have your subject that is exposed in a certain experiment. So then, after the experimental period, the subject or the students exposed to the experimental factor are given a post-test. So right after the experiment, so the certain subject is going to or to have a post-test. So this achievement of this experimental group is then compared with the achievement of the another group with similar characteristics and studying at the same subject made under customary instruction methods but unexposed to the experimental factor. The difference is the first one is exposed to a certain experiment. Then the other one, which is not exposed to experimental factor. So what will happen, or there is any access of the achievement experiment group over the achievement of the normal group is considered due to the experimental factor. Okay, for example, a teacher uses praise in one but not in the other of her two classes, who were not sectioned on any selective basis and are taking the same lessons. At the end of the grading period, she compares the achievements of the two classes. Any excess of the achievement of the class with praise over the achievement of the class without praise is considered due to the use of praise. Okay, number two. Number two, we have a single group with a pre-test and a post-test design. So this group is exposed to a certain experimental factor. However, before the start of the experiment, the group is given a pre-test about the subject matter to be covered in the experiment. So then, after the experimental period, the group is given the same pre-test but in different forms to avoid the effect of practice. This is the post-test. So the excess of the result of the post-test over the result of the pre-test is considered caused by the experimental factor. So, okay, for example, suppose a new technique of teaching how to solve verbal problems in mathematics is to be tested. So before the start of the experiment, the group to be used is given an achievement test about the problems to be covered. After the experimental period, the same test is in another form is given to a group as a post-test. The difference between the means of the score of the two tests after applying some statistical methods will reveal if the new technique is effective. So, number three, we have match groups design. So in this design, two groups are matched in age, sex, grade level, mental ability, etc. So one group called the experimental group is exposed to the experimental or independent variable, while the other group called the control group is not exposed to the experimental variable. After the experimental period, the two groups are given the same test, covering the subject matter studied during the period. It must be noted that all other variables except the independent variable are kept constant or equal during the experimental period. Any excess of the achievement of the experimental group over the achievement of the control group is attributed to the experimental factor. So, for example, we have a candidate for the master degree conducted an experiment to find out the effect of guidance and counseling upon the learning process. So she formed two groups of pupils in which one pupil in one group was paired with another pupil in the other group having the same sex, age, mental ability, and economic status. One group called the experimental group was given guidance and counseling during the experimental period, while the other group called the control group was not exposed to guidance and counseling. So all other variables such as lessons, tests, time spent per study, method of teaching, etc. were kept equal. After the experimental period, the two groups were given the same test on the subject matter covered by the two groups. The result was that there was a significant excess of the achievement of the experimental group over the achievement of the control group, and this excess was considered attributed to guidance and counseling. Okay, number 4. Number 4, we have randomized multigrade with a post-test design. So in this design, there are two or more experimental variables to be tested. So groups are formed equal to the number of experimental variables. The members of each group are assigned randomly to their respective groups. Each experimental factor is applied on the group to which it is assigned. All other variables, whatever activities they are kept equal in all the groups. After the experimental period, the same test on the lesson taken by all groups is given to all of them. The experimental factor assigned to the group with the highest achievement is considered the most effective. The experimental factor assigned to the group with the second highest achievement is the most effective, and so on. So randomize multi-group with a post-test. For example, suppose the three methods of teaching mathematics are to be tested. Methods A, B, and C. Three groups whose members are assigned randomly are formed. The numbers of members in the groups may be unequal, but for the convenience, they should be made equal as much as possible. The three groups studying the same topic are taught under three different methods. One method assigned to one group. After the experimental period, the three groups are given the same test. The result of the test are subjected to some statistical procedures. Usually, analysis of variance and the relative effectiveness of the methods will be known. Okay, number 5. Number 5, this is randomized multi-group with pre-test and post-test design. So this is the same as randomized multi-group with the post-test design. But the only difference is that there is First, a pretest. After the experimental, the results of the pretest and those of the post-test are subjected to some statistical methods. Usually, the analysis of the covariance and the relative effectiveness of the three methods will be revealed. So that are the five single factors of design. So the first one, again, we have single group with only post-test design. The number two, we have single group with a pre-test and a post-test design. The number three, we have match groups design. The number four, we have randomized multi-group with a post-test design. And the number five, or the last one, we have randomized multi-group with a pre-test and post-test design. So that is the experimental design. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Today our topic is about two-factor experiment, the factorial design. Factorial experimental design is a two-factor experiment in which there are two experimental factors involved. Here, the researcher manipulates two or more independent variables simultaneously to observe their effects on the dependent variables. This design is useful when there are more than two independent variables called factors to be tested. For instance, we want to know the performance of a group of males and females in a learning situation under the effects of varying amount of the same drug. In this experiment, there are two factors. First is sex, which is male or female, and second is the dosage or the amount of drugs measured in milligrams. In our analysis, we are concerned with differences in learning related to first is sex, second the amount of drug taken, and third the interaction of effect of sex and drug. In this experiment, we have to make a two-way classification. The classification of data according to sex and the classification of the same data according to drug dosage. The achievement scores of the two groups after they have taken a post-test are subjected to analysis of variance, which will reveal whether there is a significant difference between the learning capacity of males and that of females when under the effects of varying amount of the drug, and whether there is a significant difference between the scores of the whole group under the effects of the varying amount of drugs, and also the interaction between sex and drug, that is, if the two factors help each other. This will be the experimental plan. Procedure in conducting an experimental study in education, psychology, sociology, industry, and other fields. So here are the steps in conducting an experimental study. First is determining the experimental problem or topic. This is defining the problem. This helps the researcher to focus on a more narrow research area to be able to study appropriately. You have in determining the experimental topic, you have to apply the guidelines in selecting the research problems. To illustrate, a doctoral candidate who is a Spanish professor wanted to know the level of effectiveness of each of the five methods of teaching Spanish grammar, namely the use of pure Spanish drawings to illustrate the meanings of the words, especially action verbs, inductive method with English as a medium of instruction, Spanish grammar rules translated into English with grammar analysis, Spanish-Tagalog and vice versa translations, and dialogues in Spanish memorized. He also wants to know their comparative effectiveness. Second steps is surveying the related literature and studies. Reading about related literature and studies will give experimenter a better understanding of his problem and experimental design. It also helps the researcher to decide whether the topic is worth studying. The formulation of hypotheses, methodology, selection of samples, experimental designs, statistical procedures, etc., utilized in the related studies will serve as a guide in conducting his experimental study. Among the related studies reviewed by the doctoral candidate, to mention a few are the following. Letter A. Amparo Torres D. Guerrero, Some Problems in the Learning of Spanish in College, unpublished master's thesis, University of San Agustin, Iloilo City, 1954. Letter B. Leticia H. Calderon, Proposed Method in the Teaching of Spanish in Secondary Schools and Colleges in the Bicol Region, unpublished master's thesis, University of Nueva Cáceres, Naga City, 1995. Letter C. Lilia C. Fernandez, Problems de la Enseñanza de Español en las Universidades de Filipinas, unpublished master's thesis, Colegio de San Juan de Letran, Manila, 1964. And letter D. Antolin B. Martinez, A Proposed Course of Study in the Teaching of Spanish as a Second Language, with some method of teaching at the Philippine Military Academy, unpublished master's thesis, Baguio Central University, 1971. The third step is formulating the hypothesis or hypothesis. These are questions which are to be answered by the study. They are tentative conclusions about the outcomes of the experiment. They must be testable. They may be accepted as true or rejected as not true. Hypotheses are usually stated in a null form in experimental studies. Examples and hypotheses for the experiment mentioned above. Letter A. The 5 methods of teaching Spanish to be experimented upon are not effective. B. There are no significant differences in the effectiveness of the 5 methods. And that's all my topic for today. Thank you for listening.
Good morning, everyone. The next step in experimental plan is identifying the experimental variables. The independent variable will be applied and expected to cause a change or effect on the dependent variable. Both the independent and dependent variables have to be identified. This will help the experimenter in making his experimental design. In the experimental example, the independent variables are the 5 methods of teaching Spanish, and the dependent variables are the achievements of the sample students. The next step is select the appropriate experimental design. The selection of the experimental design depends upon the expected outcomes or what the experimenter wants to find out. In other words, the design that will best test the hypothesis should be selected. In the example, The experimental designs selected and used were A. For determining the effectiveness of each individual method, the single group with a pretest and a post-test design was used. Next is for determining the comparative effectiveness of the 5 methods, the randomized multigroup with a pretest and a post-test design was selected and used. The next step is selecting the sample. The sample is composed of subjects or students to be used in the experiment. The sample should be representative, large enough, and selected properly to be able to give valid and reliable generalizations. Example, the experimental designs require that the assigning of students to the 5 methods of teaching Spanish must be randomized. The experimenter used all the 5 sections of nursing students in a university taking Spanish 2. He assumed that the distribution of the students to the 5 sections was random enough because it was done on a first-come, first-served basis and not on any selective basis. One section was opened for enrollment, and when this was filled up, the next section was opened for enrollment, and when this was filled up, the next section was opened, and so on. The professor employed the raffle in assigning the 5 methods to the sections. The next step is selecting or constructing appropriate instruments to measure the results of the experiment. Choose or construct instruments that will measure accurately the outcomes of the experiment. Pretest the instruments to ensure their validity and reliability. Example, the experimenter constructed a test in Spanish, grammar, and administered it to a group of students in another college and correlated the scores of the students with their final grades. The coefficient of correlation or the validity coefficient was 0.51, which was substantial, and the reliability coefficient was 0.68, computed by using the split half method. Thank you.
Methods of research, the experimental plan. Conducting the experiment. Experiment is typically carried out by manipulating a variable, an independent variable affecting the experimental group. The effect that the researcher is interested in is now called the dependent variable. In conducting the experiment, it must be conducted according to the experimental design. There are extraneous factors enumerated by Manuel and Medel. The first factor is history. History is the specific events between the first and second measurement in addition to the experimental variable. Example, the dramatic landing on the moon could affect the measurement of a new physics course on the attitudes of the students. Fortunately, no dramatic historical event occurred during the experiment. The second one is maturation. Biological or psychological processes which operate with the passage of time regardless of events. Example, students grow older, hungrier, more bored, and which may be mistaken as the effect of the experimental stimulus. One semester cannot be long enough to cause any appreciable biological or psychological changes in the students and the professor saw to it that the students were well fed before going to their classes, and he tried hard to make the classwork as enjoyable as possible. The third factor is testing. Testing is the effects of taking a test upon the scores of a second test. Second tests may be attributable to increased awareness of item design or better insight on how to respond the second time around. To remedy this, the professor administered the same pretest after the experiment but in different form to avoid the effect of practice. The fourth one is biases. Bias in the selection of respondents in the comparison groups. Also, it uses the Hawthorne effect. Hawthorne effect is the design to find ways to increase worker productivity. Another factor is the experimental mortality. Experimental mortality is the loss of respondents from the comparison groups. From the example given earlier, there is no loss of respondent if no one dropped out during the semester when the experiment was being conducted. The last factor enumerated by Manuel and Medel is the interaction effects. It is the effects of the experimental factor and some other variables such as experimental settings, reactive effect of testing, and the prior treatment interference. Example is the professor saw to it that all non-experimental variables that would adversely affect the results had to be kept equal as practically as possible among the groups, such as time, conditions of the rooms, the job praise, keeping absences to the minimum, non-scolding of students as much as possible, the giving of quizzes and tests, and other classroom practices. Another procedure in conducting experimental plan is measuring the results and applying statistical procedures. Results need to be measured and the statistical methods have to be applied to determine their significance. The experimenter should administer a pretest to the subject and after it administered a posttest. A posttest should be the same with the pretest but different in form. This is to measure the results. And after that, applied statistical procedures to the achieving scores of the students. Some of the statistical procedures to be used is the one-tailed test and analysis of covariance or ANCOVA. One-tailed test is a statistical test in which the critical area of a distribution is one-sided so that it is greater than or less than a certain value but not both. Applying the one-tailed test or t-test is used to determine the effectiveness of each method of teaching. Analysis of covariance or ANCOVA is a general linear model which blends analysis of variance or the ANOVA and regression. Applying this used to determine the comparative effectiveness of the 5 methods. The last procedure in conducting an experimental plan is writing the report of the experiment. Whatever the form the report about the experiment must be made, either in thesis form or otherwise. The results or findings especially are to be reported. There should be a complete report of the experiment from the selection of the problem to the reporting of the findings.